Hello everyone, welcome back. This is episode 4, Emergency Jazz with James. Last week we looked at jazz in smaller ensembles and the short but amazing lifespan of bebop. But this week we're picking up right where we left off in episode 2 with the big band and the role that arrangers are now having in redefining what big bands are all about. Arrangements have always been central to a big band's success since the days of Fletcher Henderson, but post-bebop, band leaders are looking for expression in other parts of their music, most notably texture, how instruments are combined, and timbre, how instruments sound individually. And this puts the arranger at the forefront of jazz composition. And there was one band leader who had these thoughts in the front of their mind even in the early 1940s. I promised we'd return to him in the last episode. He wrote some of the most famous jazz songs of all time. It's, of course, Glenn Miller. But hold on a second. Before we look at Miller's music, it's really worth stepping back and asking ourselves what exactly an arranger does. So we must go
to the keyboard.
So what does an arranger actually do? Well, they take a pre-composed melody and adapt it to the ensemble they're working with in that particular moment, writing all the parts for each instrument to make it work. And this seems simple on the surface. You take a melody and give it to someone, add accompanying lines elsewhere in the band, and the rhythm section can take care of themselves, right? They just play the chords. Simple as that, right? Wrong. Our ears, when listening to music, latch onto everything from changes in instrumentation to morphing textures and especially the movement of harmony. And this is even if we don't have musical training ourselves. The difference you feel between that song that's kind of dull, but you don't know why, and the song that's incredible, but you also don't really know why, a high chance is that's going to be down to the quality of the big band arrangements. And if we look at big bands themselves with about 17 players, playing 3 to 4 different types of saxophone, clarinets, trombones, trumpets, drums, piano, guitar, bass. A great arrangement doesn't use all of these at once. Rather, it holds back that big band sound, instead using an almost infinite number of permutations of smaller combinations of instruments. And this is a key skill in turning a good melody into a great song. Now consider that with these 17 instruments, there's an equally huge number of ways to harmonise each chord. Even lowly C major on a piano can sound completely different depending on its inversion, what note's at the bottom, and just where it's played on the piano. All C major, they all sound very different. That's just one instrument. Imagine the possibilities with the tone quality of an entire big band at your disposal. And the straw that breaks the camel's back here is that every instrument has a large number of colours it can make just by itself. A trombone, for example, can use many different mutes. Sounds very different in its low and high register. And can play everything from triple piano to fortissimo and even loud. And if an arranger is not really specific with the sound they want from every instrument, you end up with a rather inexpressive big band that's very messy most of the time. And of course, these almost limitless possibilities created a fierce atmosphere of competition with big bands trying to find the best arrangements. And of course, it allowed a huge variety of personal style with each arranger finding different colours in different parts of the big band. Right, now we are ready to return to Miller, a figure enshrined in American popular history. He was a band leader who struggled mightily in his early career, went on to write some of the most famous jazz standards of all time, and then of course died tragically during the Second World War. Miller in 1921 turned pro, having just left school in Colorado, but it took 15 grueling years as a trombonist, arranger and band leader for hire before he managed to form his own band in the mid-30s. And even then, it took 2 years of hard work before he managed to find the right combination of sound and players to distinguish himself from the rest of the great bands of the day. But then, in 1939, some seemingly simple revelations about instrumentation became the foundation of a totally new sound for Miller's band. One that, riding the radio's explosive rise to prominence, as we discussed in episode 2, would catapult Miller's orchestra from nowhere to second in the charts in 1939, only to be beaten by Judy Garland's Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And the piece he did this with, of course, was Moonlight Serenade. The musical recipe for this piece was achingly simple, and yet it remains unmistakable. A lead clarinet, supported by closely harmonised saxophones, a large muted brass section with responses here and there, and a politely clumping rhythm section pootling along. And all of this combined with the lilting melody of Moonlight Serenade gave Miller a sound never heard before. Just listen to these irresistible results. Using these sounds, Miller soon hired a suite of arrangers to copy his style, including Eddie Durham, Jerry Gray and Bill Finnegan, and together with them, the Glenn Miller Orchestra stayed at the top of the charts for 3 more consecutive years, with hits like In the Mood, Tuxedo Junction and Pennsylvania 65000. When the Second World War broke out, Miller volunteered to head up the US Army Band Service, determined to revolutionise military music for troops. But he met significant resistance at first with charts like St. Louis Blues March. But it paid off, and soon Miller's military big band was a huge success. They were put on a back-breaking schedule of 13 radio appearances a week, and they toured extensively in the first half of the war. One general even wrote that Miller's orchestra was the greatest morale builder second to a letter from a home. But then, tragically, on the 15th of December 1944, Miller boarded a transport plane headed for Paris, which then tragically crashed over the English Channel with no survivors. The cause of this crash is still unknown. Now, Miller's music and his story are known across the world, but less broadcasted are the controversies that surround both his music and his organisation, the first of which being racism. You may have noticed so far the complete lack of any African American musicians in photographs. Now, while Miller does not appear to have been overtly racist, in fact he played in small bands with black musicians and hired African American arrangers like Eddie Durham, who almost certainly wrote In the Mood. Despite all this, the Glenn Miller Orchestra never had any black players. This was probably a result of commercial pressure to keep the band white so that it appealed to a more conservative, wealthier audience. But in any case, whether this was personal or institutionalised racism, from what we know about the origins and social context of jazz, Glenn Miller's white band remains deeply problematic. The other controversy concerns the music itself, with some critics of the day describing Miller's music as over-rehearsed and perfect to the point of soullessness. It was also well known that Miller looked down on extended solos and was a rather authoritarian band leader, leaving very little room for individual creativity from players. Critics believed that Miller had taken the hot jazz of Benny Goodman and Count Basie and turned it into a commercial novelty to be bought and sold by America's middle class. These musical criticisms do have some basis in truth, but they couldn't have missed the point of Miller's music any more completely. Here is a music full of innovative melodies woven into thick tapestries of textures using brand new structural devices, and all with a fierce focus on performance accuracy. This is a truly unique voice in the history of jazz, and it goes on to influence many band leaders and arrangers in the future. The other thing to consider is that Glenn Miller wrote some of the most famous songs in American history in a professional band leading career of 4 years. His entire oeuvre of compositions come in between 1939 and 1943. As I mentioned in the previous episode, the post-war era was extremely challenging for big bands across the US. There simply weren't the audiences or the dance halls capable of sustaining a 17-piece big band, especially with bebop at the height of its popularity. Even the great Count Basie was not immune here, and in 1949 he was sadly forced to disband his longtime orchestra. What followed were 3 years of soul-searching for the Count, as he played in octets and sextets around the country before meeting up with longtime friend Billy Eckstein, who told him to get his damn big band back together. With this encouragement and a crucial permanent booking at New York's Birdland Club, Basie gathered an all-star cast of bebop's greatest players and in 1952 launched his new band, The New Testament. Working with Basie in this new endeavour is young arranger Neil Hefti, who, amongst his many accolades, ends up writing the Batman theme. Hefti hit a sweet spot in his arranging for Basie. He retained the Count's big swing improvisation sound, but added a dimension of space and subtlety that hadn't been there previously. He would employ unique duos and trios within the horn section and increasingly use non-standard jazz instruments like the flute and the flugelhorn in his work, and all the while giving the Count space for his iconic commentary-style comping patterns on the piano. Neil Hefti's work remains to this day a standard by which all great jazz arrangements are measured. And at the time, more importantly, unlike other big bands who were stuck in an older style of playing, the Basie band became the envy of all with a wave of new public support. With this, the hits start to roll in with landmark albums like Basie Talks, Dance Sessions, Basie Roars Again, and the immortal 1956 album, April in Paris. He has the best album covers, by the way, here. But there is one album that stands head and shoulders above the rest for me, and that is the 1957 record, Mr. Atomic Basie. And on this record, there's one track that, for me, exemplifies what the bandleader-arranger relationship can do at its best, and that is their recording of Lil Dime. And Hefti wrote this originally as a medium swing, but Basie had the wherewithal to slow it to an almost glacial tempo, and the result is a masterclass in groove and space. Isn't that absolutely stunning? There's also a crucial technological innovation that encourages these arrangers to flex their compositional muscles like never before, and that is the release of the 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM LP record in 1948. And before this, the 10-inch 78s could barely hold 3.5 minutes of music per side, but this new record could flaunt 22 minutes per side. And longer sides meant longer songs and more space for arrangers to have fun with structures. No other band takes advantage of this technological breakthrough more than the Duke Ellington Orchestra. Unlike Count Basie, who had a fleet of arrangers working for him, not just Neil Hefti, but Thad Jones, Eddie Durham, and even a young Quincy Jones, all of the music for Ellington's orchestra in the 50s was written by himself and the great Billy Strayhorn. And now, with 22 minutes per side to play with, there's a possibility not just to write individual songs into an album, but for an album to exist as itself, as one artwork, a concept album, as you will. And Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington in 1957 arguably created the first ever concept album of popular music. It was entitled Such Sweet Thunder, and it was a 75-minute epic reflection on the collected works of William Shakespeare. Now, you need to listen to the whole thing to really get to love this album, but listen here to this small section of the first track, the detailed and nuanced orchestration and the beautiful colours that come out of it. Billy Strayhorn is the unsung hero of the Ellington Orchestra. From 1938 onwards, he writes many of the Duke's orchestrations and adds an unprecedented clarity and polish to the band's sound. And the result of this tight-knit collaboration between the two is an orchestration that's deeply intimate, and it remains cohesive despite the inevitable turnover of personnel and the Duke's vast array of orchestral colours. Also, Billy's music never stood still. He was constantly rearranging songs that he'd written a decade earlier, like Take the A Train, to keep them fresh for each performance. After a drop in popularity in the early 50s, the Duke was desperate for a big standout album to get him back under the national spotlight, and this led to the orchestra's most explosive concert of the 1950s, the Newport Jazz Festival of 1956. This concert was jam-packed with Strayhorn's brand new orchestrations, and it whipped the crowd into an absolute frenzy. You can hear them whooping and hollering like mad creatures. You must get this album. The gig finished hours late, with encore after encore being called, and it culminated in a 27-chorus saxophone solo of Paul Gonsalves, on the tune Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue. This performance literally relaunched Duke Ellington's career, and critics have since hailed it the best performance of his entire life. So you may have noticed that today I've only looked at this story through 3 band leaders in Glenn Miller, Count Basie and Duke Ellington, but it's because they really do epitomise this changing relationship between arranger and band leader during this era. There are so many fantastic artists I simply have not had the time to mention. Most notably perhaps is Gil Evans, who worked extensively with Miles Davis during this era, and he had a great voice for verticalization of harmony. You'll find lots of his songs in the playlist below. Also, just starting out is a young Dr. Quincy Delight Jones Jr. Quincy Jones, of course, who burst onto the big band scene in 1957 with his debut album, This Is How I Feel About Jazz. He wrote almost all of it himself, and we will certainly be returning to him in later episodes. And one final name I'd be foolish to omit is Stan Kenton, whose 1951 album City of Glass was a fantastical fusion of contemporary classical experimentalism and jazz instruments and jazz harmony. It was so ahead of its time that it didn't have an appreciative audience for 30 years, but both Duke Ellington and Count Basie attended concerts and raved about it. To finish today's journey, I offer you all a listening challenge. And below the video, you'll find a brand spanking new Spotify playlist, chock-a-block with further listening in this 1950s big band world, and ask you to find 2 songs in particular there: Splanky from Basie's Mr. Atomic album, and Take the A Train from Ellington's 1956 Newport performance. And I simply ask you to switch on your ears and listen with everything we've spoken about today. What's happening with the instruments? Is that unique in the recording of this chart? Are the arrangers playing with the song structures? Just listen to the beautiful colours that Neil Hefti and Billy Strayhorn are pulling out of their respective orchestras. Other than that, there's nothing that remains to be said other than thank you so very much for watching today, and I'm already looking forward to next week where we'll see you for a little bit more.